The photograph came to me through an auction house that specialized in Victorian ephemera. They'd acquired it as part of a larger collection from an estate in upstate New York, and they wanted it authenticated and appraised before putting it up for sale. I'm a specialist in 19th century photography, particularly post-mortem and memorial images. So they thought I might be interested in what they'd described as an unusual Victorian family portrait. When I opened the package, I understood immediately why they'd called me. The photograph showed two infants, twins, probably, around 6 months old, dressed in white gowns and sitting on upholstered chairs. Behind them sat what appeared to be their mother, wearing a dark dress, and with her head completely covered by a dark cloth or veil. The backdrop showed a painted garden scene, typical of studio photography from the period. The image quality was remarkable for its age, though the paper had yellowed, and there were some spots of foxing. But what made it truly unsettling was the covered figure behind the children. The cloth obscured the person's entire head and face, creating a featureless, vaguely human shape. At first glance, I thought it might be an example of hidden mother photography, a common Victorian technique where mothers were draped or concealed so that infants could be photographed without the distraction of an adult face in the frame. Exposure times in the 1870s were still long enough that babies needed to be held still, so mothers or nurses would hold them while being hidden from the camera. But something about this image felt different. The way the cloth hung, the complete coverage, extending down past the shoulders, and, most disturbingly, the position of the hands, barely visible beneath the draping but positioned in a way that didn't look quite natural for someone actively supporting the children. I examined the photograph more closely under magnification. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Rose and Lily Hartwell, March 1870. Forgive us." Forgive us. Those two words made my skin prickle. I'd seen thousands of Victorian photographs, and never had I encountered an inscription like that. Forgive us. For what? I began researching the Hartwell name, in connection with New York in 1870. I found them in the census records. Thomas Hartwell, age 32, occupation, physician. His wife, Caroline, age 28, and two daughters, Rose and Lily, both listed as age 1, born 1869. Twins, just as I'd suspected. I found more information in city directories and newspaper archives. Thomas Hartwell had been a respected doctor in Utica, New York. He'd married Caroline Brennan in 1867. Their twin daughters had been born in September 1869. Then I found their death records. Rose Hartwell died March 15, 1870. Age 6 months. Cause of death, scarlet fever. Lily Hartwell died March 17, 1870. Age 6 months. Cause of death, scarlet fever. The twins had died 2 days apart, probably from the same illness that had swept through the household. The photograph on the back said March 1870, which meant this portrait had been taken around the time of their deaths, either just before or just after. I looked at the children's faces again. They appeared healthy, alert, looking toward the camera with the solemn expressions typical of babies being photographed. But now that I knew when they'd died, I noticed something else. The lighting on their faces was very slightly different from each other, as though they'd been photographed separately and the images combined. And the more I looked at the covered figure behind them, the more wrong it appeared. I scanned the photograph at high resolution and began enhancing different sections. When I zoomed in on the draped figure's hands, I felt my breath catch. The hands were visible beneath the fabric, resting on what appeared to be the arms of the chair,
but they weren't positioned the way you'd expect if the person were alive and actively holding or supporting the children. They were too still, too rigid. And when I adjusted the brightness and contrast, I could see something else. The fingers had a waxy, artificial appearance that reminded me of other post-mortem photographs I'd studied. The covered figure wasn't hiding a living mother who didn't want to be in the photograph. The covered figure was hiding a dead mother who couldn't be shown. I kept researching, my hands shaking slightly as I typed. I found Caroline Hartwell's death record. Died March 14, 1870. Cause of death: scarlet fever. Caroline had died the day before her daughter Rose, and 2 days before Lily. The entire family had been struck by scarlet fever in March 1870. Caroline had died first, then Rose, then Lily. Within the span of 4 days, Thomas Hartwell had lost his wife and both his daughters. And, before they died, or perhaps after, he'd arranged for this photograph to be taken. A family portrait showing his wife and daughters together one last time. But Caroline had already been dead when the photograph was taken. She was there physically, posed in the chair, but her face had been covered because... Why? Because death had already changed her appearance. Because Victorian mourning customs demanded it. Because Thomas couldn't bear to see her face and know she was gone. I found more information in a local newspaper from March 1870. The community mourns the loss of the Hartwell family, struck down by the scarlet fever in the space of 4 days. Dr. Thomas Hartwell, though spared by the disease himself, has lost his beloved wife Caroline and his twin daughters Rose and Lily. The funeral service will be held at St. John's Episcopal Church on March 19th, with interment at Forest Hill Cemetery. Dr. Hartwell requests privacy during this time of unimaginable grief. Unimaginable grief. That's what had led Thomas Hartwell to commission this photograph. The desire to have one image showing his family together, even though one, or all of them, were already dead when the photograph was taken. I examined the image again with this new understanding. The twins were positioned carefully in their chairs, dressed in their white gowns. Were they alive when this photograph was taken? Or had they already died, their bodies posed one final time? I enhanced the children's faces, looking for the telltale signs of post-mortem photography. The too still quality, the slightly unfocused eyes, the unnatural positioning. But I couldn't be certain. Post-mortem photographs of infants were common in the Victorian era, and photographers had become skilled at posing the dead to appear as though they were merely sleeping. But there was something about the way the children were arranged. They sat in separate chairs rather than together. Their bodies were supported carefully, propped at angles that suggested they weren't supporting themselves. And when I examined their eyes closely, I noticed that while both children looked toward the camera, there was a flatness to their gaze that might indicate they weren't actually seeing anything. I found one more piece of evidence in the newspaper archives. A brief notice that appeared a week after the funeral. Dr. Thomas Hartwell
wishes to thank the community for their support during his recent loss. He has closed his medical practice indefinitely and will be residing with his brother in Albany. He asks that his privacy be respected as he processes this profound tragedy. Thomas had left Utica entirely, unable to remain in the place where his family had died. I traced him through records and found that he never returned to medical practice. He lived with his brother for 2 years, then moved west to Ohio, where he remarried in 1875 and had 2 more children. He died in 1903 at age 65. But he'd kept the photograph.
It had remained in his possession until his death, then had been passed down through his second family, who apparently never knew the full story of the image. Eventually, it had ended up in the estate sale where the auction house had acquired it. I compiled my findings and sent them to the auction house, along with my analysis of the photograph. I explained that this was an example of Victorian post-mortem photography, though an unusual one. It appeared to show a mother who had died of scarlet fever being posed with her infant daughters, who may have also been dead or dying when the photograph was taken. The inscription, "Forgive us," now made terrible sense. Thomas Hartwell was asking forgiveness for what he'd done, for posing his dead wife with their daughters, for creating this macabre family portrait, for trying to capture one last moment of them together, even though death had already torn them apart. The auction house decided not to sell the photograph. Instead, they donated it to a museum that specialized in Victorian death culture and memorial practices. It now sits in their collection, carefully preserved and displayed with full context about the Hartwell family tragedy. I've returned to look at it several times. Each time, I notice something new. The way the cloth covering Caroline's head has been carefully arranged, almost tenderly. The precise positioning of the twins, both looking toward the camera, but perhaps not seeing it. The hands beneath the draping, so still and rigid. And I think about Thomas Hartwell, a physician who understood death intimately, but who couldn't save his own family. A man who'd watched his wife die on March 14th, then had to make the impossible decision of what to do next. His daughters were still alive, but he must have known they were infected. Must have known they would likely follow their mother into death. So he'd arranged for this photograph. Perhaps Caroline's body had been prepared, but not yet buried. Perhaps he'd had her dressed and posed in the chair, her face covered, because he couldn't bear to see death's transformation of the woman he'd loved. Perhaps he'd placed his daughters, still alive, or perhaps already dead, beside her for one final portrait. A family together, one last time. A moment preserved in silver and paper, even though it was a moment that had never really existed. His wife was dead. His daughters were dead or dying. But in the photograph, they were all present, all together, frozen in time, before everything ended. The photograph is both beautiful and heartbreaking. The twins in their white gowns, so carefully posed, the painted garden backdrop suggesting life and growth, and the dark, shrouded figure of the mother, present but hidden,
there but not there, participating in this family portrait, even though she'd already left the world of the living. Victorian mourning culture embraced death in ways that modern society finds disturbing. Post-mortem photography was common, a way of preserving the image of loved ones before they were buried and gone forever. But this photograph goes beyond the typical memorial portrait. This is a man's desperate attempt to have one image of his family intact. One moment where they were all together, even if that moment was a lie. The covered face haunts me most. Caroline Hartwell's features hidden beneath the cloth. Her identity erased, reduced to a dark, featureless shape. Was it Thomas's decision to cover her, or was it the photographer's? Was it because her appearance had changed too much in death? Or was it simply too painful for Thomas to see her face and know she would never see his again? The inscription says, "Forgive us." Not forgive me, but forgive us. Who was the us? Thomas and the photographer, both complicit in creating this image? Thomas and Caroline, both responsible in some way for the decisions that led to this moment? Or was it a collective guilt, a family shame, at trying to deny death even as it claimed them all? The photograph raises questions that will never be answered. Were the twins already dead when it was taken? Or were they in their final hours, too weak to protest being arranged for the camera? Did Thomas hold them one last time before this photograph? Or was this photograph the last time he would see them before they were prepared for burial? I've spent my career studying death photography, but this image disturbs me more than any other I've encountered. Perhaps because it's so intimate, so personal. There's no attempt here to make death look peaceful or dignified. The covered face acknowledges that something is wrong, that this is not a normal family portrait, that someone here should not be present or should not be hidden. The mother holding the children was covered for a reason, not to hide her from the camera, but to hide death itself, to create the illusion of a family portrait, while acknowledging that the family was already broken. The death had already claimed them, that this moment of togetherness was artificial, staged, a lie, told by a grieving man who couldn't accept what he'd lost. The photograph survives. Thomas Hartwell, Caroline, Rose, and Lily are all buried in Forest Hill Cemetery in Utica, New York. Their graves are still there, though the stones have weathered, and the inscriptions are hard to read. But in the photograph, they remain. The twins in their white gowns. The covered figure behind them, present but hidden. There, but not there. And somewhere beyond the frame, Thomas Hartwell, the father and husband who commissioned this image, who asked forgiveness for what he'd done, who tried to capture one last moment with his family, even though that family existed only in the photograph, never in reality. The mother was covered because she was dead. The children were posed because they were dead or dying. The photograph was taken because a man couldn't bear to let go, couldn't accept that his family was gone, needed one image to prove they'd existed, that they'd been together, that they'd been his. And now, more than 150 years later, that image remains,
a testament to Victorian mourning culture, to a father's desperate love, to the way photography can preserve what should be let go. The covered figure sits behind the children, her face hidden, her identity erased. But her presence speaks volumes about grief, about loss, about the desperate human need to hold on to what's already gone. Forgive us, the inscription says. But there's nothing to forgive, only tragedy to remember, only loss to acknowledge, only a family frozen in time, together in death if not in life, preserved forever in a photograph that should never have been taken, but that someone needed to exist. The mother holding them was covered for a reason, and now we know why.